let's just take a moment to bring up the motivation of bodhicitta. In particular, this case, right, that we're studying Lama Tsongkhapa's teaching on emptiness in order to achieve enlightenment for the welfare of all sentient beings, to liberate ourselves and others from suffering and its causes, lead ourselves and all sentient beings to liberation and full enlightenment. With that in mind, then we can do the verse we start with. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings.
Lord, would you turn that on or turn it up? Or?
Oh, it's on, but is it not? Is the volume not good?
Oh, now it's good. That's good.
Can I bring it closer? Maybe that's the issue. Is that better? Is it closer?
Yeah.
So a quick introductory thought is, just wanted to say, it feels auspicious or nice to be studying a teaching, this is one of the core teachings of Lama Tsongkhapa, and we're, I guess it's actually, it's roughly, this is not quite tomorrow, today, in Tibet, but tomorrow is actually Lama Tsongkhapa Day, right, the anniversary of his passing, and so, like in Tibet, they would traditionally offer a lot of butter lamps and do Guru Puja, things like that. But I guess maybe Dodrup's going to do that tomorrow. I'm not sure here. But anyway, it feels like a. Actually, one time when I was in India, I remember this. I was only there twice, but the last time, His Holiness Dalai Lama said, said a lot of people, like, to honor Lama Tsongkhapa, people recite the Miksema, his mantra, right? Like his name mantra. Actually, he composed that in honor of his guru, and then his guru changed it and put his name in it and said, no, it's more in honor, it's more accurate to describe you. And so that's how it became his. Wow. So it's like he wrote that for Rendawa, who was like a Sakya Lama, who was one of his main teachers, and then Rendawa took the verse and changed it around so it applied, and he said, this is actually in honor of you or something. But anyway, so Dalai Lama said, something like many people will recite 100,000 of those as their Nundro of Guru Yoga. And then he said, something like, I can't remember exact words, but basically he said that's good, but better to study his teachings. And he said, if you were to read, and he mentioned this in particular as one of the teachings of Lama Tsongkhapa that's very essential. So he listed a number of, I think, 5 different teachings, but this is one. And he said, if you really want to honor Lama Tsongkhapa and know Lama Tsongkhapa, then study this. So we're doing that. Okay, and then we're in the section on, here it's called Special Insight, right, or the section on the view, you could say, or a section on emptiness. We just started that last class. It's like how to train in special insight. And the overall topic, these topic headings, remember, they're by Trijang Rinpoche. The text is, the whole text is by Lama Tsongkhapa, but the outline, Trijang Rinpoche added that, Dalai Lama's junior tutor. Right, so we're in the section called Explanation of How to Train in Special Insight, the Entity of Wisdom.
Which page is that?
We're actually up to page 242, but I went back to 238, just to the beginning of the section. And I'm just going to quickly summarize what we said last week, which is, just a quick summary is that, so Lama Tsongkhapa says here, if we're going to study wisdom, then he says, so which, obviously we're studying the teachings of the Buddha. Then he says, but among the teachings of the Buddha, there are all these different tenet systems and different philosophical views, and he says, so who should we rely on, right? And then he says we'll follow Atisha, the great master who founded the Lamrim lineage, and we'll follow the teachings of Nagarjuna, right, who explains emptiness in a definitive way. And he says, but even after Nagarjuna, there are different interpretations then of Nagarjuna. Like Nagarjuna is interpreting, is called one of the two great trailblazers, right? And he sort of interprets the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras in a very elegant and profound, beautiful way. And so Lama Tsongkhapa points out, then after Nagarjuna, different people sort of had different views about what Nagarjuna meant, and he says, so among those, we're going to follow Chandrakirti, who is the same person, right, who we've been studying with Gyume Khyentse Rinpoche. And you'll notice that this text, actually you'll notice that, actually I thought that I also wanted to mention that. So these are related, like Lama Tsongkhapa, actually those are the five. Lama Tsongkhapa wrote 5 main texts, like most important texts on emptiness. This is one of them. Another is his commentary to Chandrakirti that Khyentse Rinpoche has been teaching. And actually those are his 2 final. Of the 5 great treatises or great texts that Lama Tsongkhapa wrote on emptiness, the last 2 of them are this and Illumination of Thought, his commentary to Chandrakirti's Supplements of the Middle Way, which is what Khyentse Rinpoche has been teaching for 2 years and has agreed to continue teaching. So, studying these, what's the word, like, in concert is quite useful. This one helps you understand that one helps you understand this one, and so on. Okay. So that's like the tradition we're going to follow. And he says here, actually, at the top of page 241, he says, we'll follow Master Chandrakirti and also Buddhapalita. Buddhapalita and Chandrakirti's philosophies are considered to be the same. They have the same philosophical positions. And then he says, and like, they wrote following Nagarjuna, and then he says, and we'll take teachings from Master Bhava Viveka, correct, and then he says, like, refuting those that, he says that, actually Chandrakirti refuted the points that Bhava Viveka made that were slightly incorrect, but kept other parts of Bhava Viveka's teachings. But that essentially, Lama Tsongkhapa's view is, I think it's fair to say his view, you'll see as we go through, his view is Chandrakirti made no errors. Chandrakirti's interpretation of emptiness is the definitive, absolutely correct interpretation, and Lama Tsongkhapa follows that. Okay, and then the next section, we started this on page 241, but I just want to mention one point, which is, so Lama Tsongkhapa now says, he calls this section Identification of Afflicted Ignorance. And what he's getting at here, right, and he says it at the bottom of page 241, he says, you must meditate on suchness, or emptiness, right, as the antidote to ignorance. Right? In other words, so what he says earlier in that paragraph or in that section is, ignorance is the first of the 12 links of dependent origination, which means ignorance is the root cause of samsara. Right? And the only way to become liberated from samsara is to eliminate ignorance. Now he's saying, so you must meditate on suchness or emptiness in order to eliminate that ignorance. Then he says, moreover, unless you have identified ignorance, you will not know how to cultivate its antidote. Therefore, it is extremely important to identify ignorance. Right? And so here he's saying, if you can't identify ignorance in your own experience, then your understanding of emptiness will not be correct. It will not be an antidote to that ignorance. And so, again, I just want to emphasize this sentence here, because as we start to get into some of the philosophical points Lama Tsongkhapa makes, if you don't remember that point, which he'll bring up again, similar points, but then you can have the wrong understanding that he's like saying something that's just intellectual. But he's not. What he's saying is, you experientially have to identify your own experience of ignorance, or you can't meditate effectively on emptiness. And your meditation on emptiness won't be an antidote to ignorance, it'll be something else. He gives different metaphors. Later in here, he'll give a metaphor where he says, like, it'd be like, well, actually, that's for a different point. So one metaphor Tibetans sometimes give is they say, otherwise it's like, if you hear that a thief is going to come in your back door, and so you say, okay, I'm going to go lock my front door. In other words, it won't protect you from suffering. It's like, it'll be the wrong antidote, and it won't serve the function. So you have to identify ignorance in your own experience. Okay, so that's really important. And then he says here at the top of 242, which is the page we're on, ignorance is the opposite of knowledge, right? But knowledge, on the other hand, should not be taken as just any knowledge, right? So he's saying, also he's making another point. He's saying, this word ignorance, right? He's starting to help us, how do you identify your own experience of ignorance, right? And so he's making another point here. He's saying, actually, you could say it this way. We have a lot of different kinds of ignorance, right, don't we? And he's saying, you have to identify the correct kind. In other words, like, not all of those kinds of ignorance are problematic, but they're not all the root cause of samsara, right? So he's making this point. He's saying, when I'm talking here about ignorance, I'm talking about the fundamental ignorance of self-grasping, right? Grasping at a self, as it's identified in the system of Chandrakirti. And it's really important, as we're going to get into this now, is part of what he's saying is, if you first of all, there are kinds of ignorance that have nothing to do with emptiness, right? Like, I don't know, I can't remember the names of all the presidents or something. That's totally irrelevant, right? But then even in terms of self-grasping, we're going to get into, there are grosser forms of grasping at a self that are philosophically acquired. And then there's the innate self-grasping that we have had since beginningless time, and that insects have, and that all beings have. We're in samsara. And what he's saying is, you have to identify that ignorance. Does that make sense? So it's not just any old ignorance that you have to identify. You have to identify the ignorance grasping at an inherently existent self. And only once you've identified that can you effectively meditate on and realize emptiness. And in the tradition they often emphasize it. Lama Tsongkhapa is emphasizing it, and the tradition that comes from emphasizes it. So there's this term that he uses sometimes here called the object of negation, right? Which is ignorance, right? Or the object that ignorance grasps at, another way to put it, is the object of negation. Actually, really, I'll say more philosophically correctly, you can say it this way, and Khenpo Rinpoche says it this way, is actually we have to negate both the object we grasp at, which is the inherently existent self, and the mind grasping at it. Both of those have to be severed or cut off by wisdom. And if you can't identify those and you identify something else and you cut that off, it won't stop. It won't serve the function of stopping samsara. Okay, does that make sense?
Again, please?
The part about the subject and object, or the general
Yes.
point about? Yeah. So one point that Khenpo Rinpoche emphasizes sometimes, this is philosophically correct in the Prasangika school's view, is this. Is actually you get it experientially. It's all so self-grasping, right? It's like there's this appearance of an inherently existent self that appears to us, and then there's a mind that grasps at that and believes in it, and sort of what they sometimes say, ascribes to it or endorses it or invests in it or something. The mind that grasps is probably the right word. So it's the mind grasping that inherently existent self, and so. One point that Khenpo Rinpoche sometimes makes, which is following Lama Tsongkhapa, is when you meditate on emptiness, you have to, I'm going to use the word cut off, or stop, or bring a cessation to the appearance of that object, the inherently existent I, but also the mind grasping it has to stop. And not the mind in general doesn't stop, but what happens is that there's a subtle, one way of describing it is this, is you imagine here's the inherently existent I, and here's the mind grasping it. Then there's a subtle part of your mind that starts to analyze, engage in an ultimate analysis of the ontological status of that. In other words, does that really exist? You start analyzing. Is that real, or is that false? And what Khenpo Rinpoche is saying is that little part of your mind that analyzes, in his recent book, Yeshe calls that the mindfulness fish. It's funny. But it's this little subtle part of your mind that analyzes. And so what Khenpo Rinpoche is saying is, when that mind analyzing does its analysis correctly, the object, the self, disappears, because it's not real. It's not it's a false object, a hallucination that disappears. And the mind grasping at it disappears. And what continues is that wisdom mind that analyzed and that now realizes emptiness. So both the subject and the object of self-grasping have to kind of stop, have to cease. And what continues is that in that moment is a mind of wisdom realizing emptiness, which is the lack of existence of that of the self. So okay, so we'll continue. So
but the mind doesn't automatically cease when the object of negation ceases.
no, consciousness continues, but that particular
But that mind
That-
still continues.
I mean, that's why I say the wisdom part of the mind continues, but the self-grasping, it's like, I mean, just to be clear, yeah, it's not saying that the mind stops, but it would be like, for example, just to use a grosser example, if somebody's like, if somebody were, when somebody has extreme hatred towards or anger towards somebody, and then the person, let's say the person comes and apologizes, and they apologize sincerely, and suddenly your anger dissipates, and you don't feel any anger anymore. You feel a sense of warmth toward it. Let's say they really apologize so clearly that you feel a sense of empathy for them, and like you realize, oh, they feel terrible, and I like them now. The mind of anger has ceased. Your mind hasn't ceased, but the mind of anger has ceased. So it's like that. The mind of self-grasping has ceased. The mind hasn't ceased, but the mind of self-grasping has ceased. In the same way, like the mind of anger can cease, but the mind continues on.
But only pertaining to that object in that instance.
Yeah, it'll come back unless, well, actually, I mean, unless you achieve liberation. If you achieve the eighth bhumi, then it doesn't come back. Yeah.
But
for
that
example,
object appears in front of you again, self-grasping is probably still there.
yeah, that's true.
Just happens.
Yeah, right. Because I mean, like the point when there's no longer any self-grasping, in the Hinayana path, the person will be an arhat, or the Mahayana path, the person will be at least at the eighth bhumi. Then that doesn't arise anymore. But until that point, they say that some form of self-grasping can still arise. So then it says, so he's making this point, right? He says, so it's not just any kind of knowledge. Then he says, now we're on page 242. The wisdom knowing the suchness of selflessness, he says, that wisdom, well, he's making a point here. He's saying it's the exact opposite of self-grasping, right? Where self-grasping believes in the independent self or the truly existent self, and this mind of wisdom realizes the lack of existence of that object, right? And so it's a direct antidote. And he's saying that this kind of ignorance requires a direct antidote. So if you can't identify the very specific exact form of ignorance he's talking about, then you can't apply a direct antidote to it, and then that won't serve the function of stopping samsara. So does that make sense? That's what he's saying. And then he says, it's a superimposition of a self, right? This word, I think, is important, superimposition, right? Because what he's saying is, you're imposing something that's not there, right? So there's no truly existent self there, but you're imposing that. So that word, right? Like, it's like an imposition, a superimposition, right? So there's no truly existent self there, but you're superimposing that self onto things. It's not real, right? It doesn't exist where you're imposing it, but you're superimposing it there. And then he says, and there are two types of such superimpositions, which we're going to go into in detail, so I'll just mention it again. One is, and these are, this is interesting, okay, so we'll say it first. He says the two types of self are a self of persons and a self of objects. In some philosophical schools, including some interpretations of Nagarjuna, like the Svatantrika Madhyamikas, they believe that the self of persons is kind of grosser, and the self of phenomena is subtler, is a subtler superimposition. Chandrakirti, who we're following, doesn't agree with that. His view is that they're equally subtle, that they're the same, that the emptiness, realizing the emptiness of persons and realizing the emptiness of phenomena are equally subtle emptinesses, that both must be realized to achieve liberation, whereas Svatantrika Madhyamikas think that you just have to realize the selflessness of person, of yourself, to achieve liberation, you have to realize the selflessness of phenomena to achieve omniscience. Chandrakirti says that's wrong. His view is that you have to realize that those two kinds of ignorance are equally gross or equally subtle, and you have to realize the emptiness of both to achieve liberation. So that's the position Lama Tsongkhapa is taking here. And then he's also, what's there to say, right? Oh, and I guess the other point I was going to say is that, so the difference is not the nature of the self-grasping or the type of self-grasping. The difference is just categorization, right? If it's applying to yourself, it's person. If it's applying to an object, it's phenomena. That's all. So it's just like a categorization of what that is applying to. And I make the point, there's a use to that because I'm going off a little bit from what I'm not. This is just a side comment to explain why that's one reason why that's important. And actually, Ken Sherp said it. He said, when explaining emptiness, one usually starts by describing the emptiness of objects, things, right? Like so, Tibetans always say a vase, right? Tibetans will say a vase or a pillar, are typical objects, but you could use any, right? Or Chandrakirti uses a chariot, right? We could say a car, something like that. So there are certain like objects that they use that because it's easier sometimes to explain emptiness in reference to an object, right? Like a cup, or because they have a limited number of parts and you can like see them and it's easier to talk about. But then when it comes to realizing emptiness, one has to begin with oneself. The self of oneself. Does that make sense? That's the first object you realize emptiness with. So from a practical, even though the self of person and the self of phenomena are equally subtle, from the perspective of discussing the topic and also of meditation, it's a useful categorization. And they say that first you realize selflessness in relation to your own self, and then it becomes easy to realize that in relation to objects. So that's why they differentiate. That's one of the reasons. There are other reasons. That's one of the reasons they differentiate those categories. Because you could say, why bother differentiating it? It's all the selflessness. But from a practical perspective, there's a use to that.
It's somewhat consistent with this Tantrika saying that the self is a grosser. Can you repeat that?
Say it louder, she could.
I'm saying I can see some consistency there with this Tantrika saying that the self is a grosser grasping. Like, even though Chandrakirti is disagreeing, he is saying start with the self.
Yep.
So you're starting with the one that's
more,
I won't say easier because it's not, but more attainable or something.
Yeah, I'm not really sure why, but they say experientially that the observation has been that people realize it first in relation to their own self, and then it becomes easier to realize it in relation to objects. Heard something about that, but I'm not sure. So, now he says, and I mentioned this last time. This is the last paragraph I covered last time, but it's so important that I'm mentioning it again. He says, the manner of superimposition. Right, so this is this is right. He said, if you don't get this right, the rest won't work. Right. So he says the manner of superimposition. Right. Meaning this means like the manner of the ignorance or the nature of the ignorance is to apprehend that phenomena exist by way of their own entity, by way of their own character, or inherently. Right. So he's using different terms to try to get across a meaning. Right. So you're superimposing that things exist by way of their own entity, by way of their own character, or inherently. And then he quotes a sutra that's often quoted in the context of teaching on emptiness, called this question of Polysutra, and it's a verse. It says, the various flowers that gladden the mind, the golden, resplendent, attractive mansions, both completely lack a creator. They are posited by the power of conception. The world is imputed by the force of conception. Right? So what he's saying, that's the Buddha talking, right? And so I think he's in this particular sutra, you think he's talking about like a celestial realm or something, but they use that as an example of all realms and all things, right? What they're saying is all things that exist are posited or imputed by the force of conception. Right? So they exist in dependence upon the conceptual mind, right? So here, he's trying to point out, right, why use that quote? In part, he's pointing out, right, that's the, that not realizing that, right, not realizing that things exist imputed by the conceptual mind, we think they exist inherently, right, or by way of their own character, right? We don't think, we don't experience, we don't recognize that things exist posited or imputed by our own conceptual mind. So these are two opposite ways of understanding. Does that make sense? Ignorance grasps things as if they exist, again, by their own entity. You see, he's trying to get he's using this quote from the Buddha, I think, to give us a better understanding of what own entity means. Does that make sense? So, like, one way for a thing to exist is by way of its own entity, or its own character, or inherently from its own side. Right? Another way that things could exist is posited by our conceptual mind, or imputed or labeled by our own conceptual mind. And so he's saying we experience ourselves and all phenomena as if they existed by way of their own entity, intrinsically, inherently, as something more than what's we experience. And that's another way sometimes they say this is we experience things as if there's something more than that there's something more there than existing through mere dependence upon the conceptual mind, right? Something from its own side, something intrinsic, something, again, with its own entityness, like there. And he's saying that's incorrect, right? Things exist posited by the power of the conceptual mind. Then he says, it's the same point in a different way. He says, he quotes 60 stanzas on reasoning, which is a text by Nagarjuna that says, since the perfect Buddha said, the world has ignorance as its cause, why would it be invalid to say that this world is due to conception? And give a sense of how, like, again, I mean, I'm going to say it right, like, if you pause, what he's saying is totally radical, isn't it? Like, the world exists through the power of conception. And so, right, and that not realizing that, we think things exist from their own side, right? Intrinsically, inherently, by their own nature. He's really trying to sort of give us these different quotes and phrases to help us understand the nature of ignorance, right? That's the section we're in, right? Understanding the nature of our own experience of ignorance, right? And part of the implication here is we never experience anything as though it exists merely due to conception, our own conceptual mind. Then he says, the commentary on the meaning of that statement so he's actually talking about the statement that he just quoted from Nagarjuna. Actually, it's a commentary by Chandrakirti he's referring to. So he says, the commentary on the meaning of that statement explains that the worlds are not established by way of their own entity, right? So you see what he's getting at here? That's what I'm saying. Like, is that existing through the power of conception or existing through its own entity are two opposite ways of being. And we, all the time, think that things exist by way of their own entity, not through the power of conception. So then he quotes Arya Deva's 400 stanzas, right, where it says, if in the absence of conception, desire and so forth do not exist, who with intelligence would uphold intrinsic realities and conception? And so there, actually I'll read the next line and then I'll explain. So now he quotes Chandrakirti also wrote a commentary to Arya Deva's 400 stanzas, so he's explaining, this is Chandrakirti's explanation of the meaning of that verse. It says, things that exist only through the existence of conception and do not exist without conception are without a doubt ascertained to be unestablished by way of their own entity, like a snake imputed on a rope. so that's a standard, you know, actually, if you, right, Khenpo Rinpoche uses that same, I mean, Chandrakirti uses that same metaphor, and Khenpo Rinpoche was mentioning, right, the snake imputed on a rope, right? And so it's an interesting example, isn't it? Like, so, you know, this example there is like, so you're walking, yeah, it's a metaphor that comes from India, right? Although the same thing can happen in America. Right, so that if you're out walking and it's dusk, right, so the light is not clear, and then you see like a certain, like a rope that's, especially it has like, just be the shape of the rope, but they say the rope has like pattern on it, you know, like some ropes are woven with a pattern. And then especially if it's night and you're out walking, and then you haven't noticed it, and then you look down, you could like leap, right, you could jump, like thinking it's a snake. But there's no snake at all, right? You know that. I mean, later if you check, right, if you shine a flashlight or something, there's no snake at all there from its own side, right? And one point that's interesting is, but the misconception of a snake is still produce an effect. You can jump, right? You might even run away. So our misconceptions function, don't they, to produce effects? And that's the example there. But it doesn't, without existing at all from its own side, right? And so, so it's a useful, interesting metaphor, right? Something that doesn't, like, so that if you were to say, does the snake exist by way of its own entity? No, right? Obviously not. Not at all. It's not even like it exists a little bit by way of its own entity, because there's no snake at all, right? And so what he's saying is that metaphor is trying to get us to understand something about the way we relate to reality, right? That we relate to all objects and react in relation to our experience, our misconception of all objects. First of all, that we are always imagining that things exist by way of their own entity, or not imagining it, but believing it. Actually, they're appearing to us that way, and we're believing that appearance. And then we're reacting all the time based on that misconception, that ignorance, right? That things exist by way of their own entity. So you get the idea of the metaphor. It's an interesting metaphor from Chandrakirti.
Dr. Lawrence, so if it were a real snake and not a rope, and the snake exists, I mean, all four natures exist, function, you know, so on and so forth. Still, it doesn't exist by the way of entity. Am I right?
Yeah, that's right. And one other reason why he uses that metaphor that's related to Rajiv's question is this, is, you know, so if that happens, right, you're walking, and then like, you know, let's say you jump and then you run, right? But then whether it be like, well, actually, let's say you're really afraid, right? So you go inside and lock the door. But then when you come, then let's say the next day the sun rises, and it's like very, you know, clear day, and you go outside, and the clear sunlight, you're like, you see that, you go, oh, it's a rope. And you might like laugh at yourself or something, like, oh wow, that's ridiculous, you know. And then you have this the clear light, you know, it's like very clear in the daytime. There's not, let's assume it's not like a rainy day or something like that. You know, you're outside, you can see that, and then you can even pick it up and like, you know, use the rope, and you're fine. You can also say that's a metaphor in a way for something else, right? Which is investigation, right? At that point, with the light, you can investigate the nature of that phenomena, and then you find there's no rope there at all. In a similar way, right, when you think of like using Rajiv's question about the snake, right? Now the snake does exist, like, there's a difference, right? The rope doesn't exist even conventionally as a snake. You reacted to it, so that's why it's a metaphor. It's not an actual example of, I mean, it's not an actual emptiness of self. But the point is, just like when you can pick up the rope and, you know, it's very clear, like sun shining, and you know it's not a snake. In the same way, right, if you analyze, so in other words, this is actually how you get the idea of entity, right? When, like, I once almost like many years ago with Vajrapani, so I almost stepped on a rattlesnake. And I jumped. That was a real snake. It was like an actual rattlesnake that like rose up. And I was like, you know, oh, wow. Like, and, you know, so there's a conventionally existent snake then, right? But then what he's getting at is if you engage in ultimate analysis, you would search, right? And that's what oftentimes when you hear different lamas teach, right? They say, okay, so if you had like each scale, one scale. Actually, sometimes you find scales, right? Like when the snake sheds its skin. So if you had that, you say, was that a rattlesnake? Well, no, that's the skin of a rat, right? And then if you took like one fang, would that be a rattlesnake, right? Or if you took like one piece of the intestine, would that be a rattlesnake? And so you could analyze, and then you would say, well, no, and none of those parts. Like this is an example. This is one of the ways of analyzing things existing by nature. Is if you analyze all the parts, you can't find a part that's the entity-ness of rattlesnake. Yeah.
What about when it bites you?
That's its functioning.
When it becomes a real rattlesnake then.
And it is because it's a conventionally existent rattlesnake then, right? It is.
It's in the nature of biting.
But this is important though, because what we're getting at is things do exist, right? This is not denying that things exist. It's denying that things exist by way of their own entity. And part of that is it can only bite you because of you also.
Right.
In other words, and you know that, right? Like in other words, part of what this is getting at, I mean, now I'm being a little not as subtle, is like, actually if you think of what's there to say this right? One way is it only exists relationally.
What do you mean by its own entity? Can you define that for me? It doesn't exist by its own entity. What does that mean?
These are good questions. This is why we're trying. And it should be confusing. Does that make sense? I want to say if I think I really know that, then I'm wrong. It's like that's a hard question, right? And I'll answer it. But I mean, it's good to struggle with this question. That's my point. Like we should be doing what you're doing right now. We should be going, what does that really mean in my own experience? Right? Like, what in the world is that talking about?
I kind of get a vague grasp of it, but that happened in the forest, and I've at times seen a stump and thought it was a bear, and to me it was a real bear. I mean, it was a real bear. Until kind of like Aslan's yard. And one time almost stepped on a snake, but that time it was a real snake. So that's that. But both of them at that moment were equally real. Internally, and maybe I'm just focusing on the feeling instead of the cerebral part.
No,
but that's why
good.
I'm kind of like, okay, so I got it. So it's not real from its own side, but it's going to bite me, and I'm going to not be in a good way.
And to answer your question about what does it mean to exist by way of its own entity, right? I'm going to go back up. It's still on the same page. We covered it. Still on page 242, a couple paragraphs up. So I'm relating Chandrakirti's commentary to Nagarjuna's 60 stanzas, the verse from Nagarjuna's 60 stanzas on reasoning, right? So Nagarjuna says, this world is due to conception. Right? He actually says, why would it be invalid to say that this world is due to conception? Right? And Chandrakirti says, the meaning of that statement explains that the worlds are not established by way of their own entity. Right? So right there, Chandrakirti and Lama Tsongkhapa answer at least this question. Right? What he's saying is, to exist by way of its own entity would be to exist in a way that is not dependent upon conception, the conceptual mind, right? So that something could be then would exist, right? Like a bear would exist as a bear independent of the conceptual mind.
Do I know under the word concept? Conception? What's a conceptual mind and what's a conception?
And one way they sometimes talk about that is actually it's interesting because this is subtle. Sometimes they'll say, right? Sometimes Tibetan lamas will say, merely labeled, right? Lama Tsongkhapa says that all the time, right? So a conceptual mind is, you could say, in that sense, the way it's being used here, right, is what Lama Tsongkhapa means when he says merely labeled.
So then and it breaks down to the word concept. Okay, so it's a concept, a conceptual car. It's an idea. Concept is an idea, isn't it?
Yep.
So worlds are not established by way of their own entity, but are merely ideas?
Or he says is due to conception, right? Or imputed by the force of conception. So you're superimposing.
Due to ideas, due to thoughts.
That's what he says here, imputed by the force of conception, or superimposed through the conceptual mind, right? That's what he's saying. So he's not saying, it's very subtle, right? He's not saying, Chandrakirti is definitely not saying, everything's only mind. See, it's very subtle, isn't it?
Is he saying that just what it is that you're seeing and perceiving is the conceptual mind?
Comes from the concept.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? He's
The
saying,
bare physiology is right there. I can touch it, it's physiologically there. But what you see and what she sees and what I see, they might be a little bit different. She might think it's a deer, you might think it's a tree, I might think it's a bear. You know, it might be none of the above, but that's all of our concept, thoughts, / ideas. So maybe is that what he's saying? Our reality, how our realities are created,
But
and
your,
that's why they're not?
your idea of fearing the bear is your own concept, right?
Well, the bear itself would be my
Because
own
not
concept.
everyone will be scared of a bear.
I wouldn't be, but
yeah,
I
different
mean,
people
of
that
a
have.
snake, for example. Like me,
Oh,
I'm scared
yeah.
of snakes.
Yeah.
Not everyone.
Right. Yeah, and again, those come like so. And this is you guys are getting it. Actually, you're getting at what you guys are getting at now is the point he made just above in a way too, which is based upon our superimposition of existing by way of its own entity. We then give rise to. Sorry, say this right. To various emotional reactions to that thing, right? And one point he's making is, and the emotional reactions themselves also don't exist by way of their own entity, right? They arise due to the initial grasping at a self, then we give rise to an emotional reaction based on that grasping, and the emotional reaction itself also exists merely through the power of conception, right? And there's a point here. It does that doesn't mean that the emotional reactions don't exist at all. They do exist. How do they exist? As merely labeled or as arising due to the power of conception, right? So in this sense, right, the snake doesn't. If it's not a rope. I mean, if there's an actual snake there, right? The snake doesn't exist by way of its own entity. My fear of it doesn't exist by way of its own entity. The I who's afraid of it doesn't exist by way of its own entity. But those things do exist conventionally, right? But they lack existence by way of their own entity, or they lack existence by way of their own nature. They lack, there are different terms used.
So how do you describe the difference between Lisa seeing that object as a snake and Lisa seeing that object as a bear?
There's no difference.
It's just gross.
There is a difference.
No, it's not. They're both a story. Well, that's the way I see it.
they're both my conception. Either that or I'm a dog, I
Or both.
don't know.
Because it's actually interesting. One point you guys are hinting at, right? So Chandrakirti, in Chandrakirti's system, the Prasangika system, they ask the question sometimes, well, how do you know if a conception, if a perception rather is valid or invalid, right? And what he says is, well, was it negated by a subsequent perception?
I kind of goes to your story about the lady in the dog tooth or whatever, thinking it was a Buddha tooth or whatever, and it wasn't.
Right, the famous story of, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it kind of goes to that, doesn't it?
Yeah, so he's getting at, in a way, like, other schools of thought would want to say there's some findable, definitive basis for that difference. Chandrakirti would say, well, it was refuted, it's like what the world says. Oh no, I went back and I saw that it was a stump. So it's but if it had been a bear, there would still be no findable ultimate basis of bareness existing from its own side. It's just conventionally later you said, I saw it was a stump. So that's like, right? It's mere conventional discussion.
As is bear.
It's a pit bull.
Oh, a picture of a bear.
Yeah.
So what does the innate mind do?
What's that?
What does the innate mind? You say there is innate mind, then there is self-grasping, then there's to the self, and there's grasping of the phenomena. So what does the innate mind do?
Okay, so Fidel's asking what's the innate mind. So what they're getting at in innate here, which he's going to get into more later in this chapter, actually in the next page, I think, is part of what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying also is that when you're identifying your own experience of ignorance, and this is why the examples that we're using are good ones, because one point he's making is he's saying there are acquired intellectual wrong understandings about the nature of the self. You know, you could say, you know, if you're like, let's say, if you were going to refute, later he'll give examples of certain Buddhist tenet systems and Hindu, but you could also have Christian or any other philosophy. You know, you could have what's the word? Philosophical from Western philosophy. It doesn't matter. What he's saying is that if you've studied a philosophical system of some kind, you know, even like if you were raised in a certain religious tradition where you think there's like a soul that exists, and then you refute that soul. He's saying that's not the innate self-grasping. That's like a branch or something of this philosophical. Sometimes Chandrakirti will refute certain other Indian schools' views of the nature of the self, but Chandrakirti himself and Lama Tsongkhapa say that's not the root of samsara. That's not going to free you from samsara. You may have to do that first. If you believe that, you know, for example, if you believe there's some, you know, if you had some belief that if you were an absolute believer in Plato and you thought there were ideal forms resting somewhere in some place and you had to refute that, well, good, you have to refute that. It's not correct from a Buddhist perspective, but that's not going to liberate you from samsara. Is his point. The innate self-grasping is the one, you know, that you experience when you think you're about to step on a snake. It's the self-grasping that you feel, you know, when you really want something and you feel, I want that. You know, it's like that feeling. That's innate. Does that make sense? And insects have that. Dogs have that. Cats have that. Bears have that. Snakes have that. We all share that self-grasping. And so what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying is you have to get at that fundamental or innate level of self-grasping, not just at some intellectually acquired idea of the self. You may have to refute those, but that's not the main thing to refute. And until you refute the one that's innate, or that's innate just means it's been there since beginningless time. It's like it's there all the time. It's until you realize emptiness. It's this what's the word? It's like it's part of your instinctual nature because it's your instinct because you've had it since beginning. You familiarized with it since beginningless time. So he's saying you have to refute that. That's what he means by innate.
So what's the base for innate?
What's
the base for innate?
The base? I'm not sure I understand.
What's the base for innate? Still mind to arise. What was to arise it? What was innate? I mean, you can say self-grasping is because of projecting. So innate mind is from what? From what?
Oh, I see. So that habit of self-grasping that he calls the innate self-grasping, the cause of that is the previous moments of self-grasping, or is that you've been doing that before, you know. And so it's like anything we do by habit, you know. Like so, in other words, like you know, why does somebody, you know, somebody who has a habit of you know, of liking, you know, somebody who, like, I'll just give a simplistic example, right? Like somebody who never had any experience of chocolate ice cream, then they're not going to want chocolate ice cream. They never heard of it, right? But then somebody who eats chocolate ice cream every night, then when they, after like dinner, they're going to want chocolate ice cream, right? Because it's their habit. It's what they're familiar with. It's what their mind then naturally gives rise to. So self-grasping, the innate self-grasping, the idea is that we've been giving rise to that, not just a little bit like after dinner, but all the time, for an infinite amount of time, since beginningless time. And so the cause of that is that previous habituation, that previous habit of giving rise to an appearance of an intrinsic self and grasping at it. So because of a previous habit, that's the cause of it.
So does it go to Buddhahood?
No, that stops.
It stops when? I mean,
And the only thing that can stop it is the wisdom realizing emptiness. So the first time that completely stops is when the person realizes emptiness directly.
okay.
So on the path of seeing, when the person realizes emptiness directly, that's the first time the person ever gets a break, a true break. Even when you've realized emptiness conceptually, there's a subtle, it's a correct realization, but there's still a subtle subject-object dualism that's a kind of still the habit of self-grasping is still there. So they say only when you realize emptiness directly on the path of seeing, that's the first time you ever get a complete break from self-grasping. And then when you achieve liberation from samsara, whether you're an arhat or the eighth bhumi, when you become liberated, then you completely stop that habit of self-grasping. But so you need a direct antidote to that, because that's the problem. That's what he's saying here, right? You need a direct antidote to that self-grasping, and the only direct antidote to that self-grasping is only one. There's no other antidote except the correct realization. And according to Lama Tsongkhapa, right, and Chandrakirti, the only antidote to that self-grasping is the realization of emptiness as it's taught by Nagarjuna, Buddhapalada, and Chandrakirti. And even if you realize the emptiness taught in some other Buddhist philosophical tenet, that still won't serve as the antidote to that and stop it. It'll still be a subtle level, and we'll get into that more. But. Right. So you get this idea though, existing by way of its own entity is the opposite, right, or means independent of the conceptual mind. Right? Yeah, and it never happens, right? You never think, I only exist through the power of the conceptual. You never experience yourself, for example, as existing merely through the power of your own, of a conceptual mind. Right? And if somebody upsets you, then you notice it. Then you can actually notice, right? If somebody says something that upsets you or does something that upsets you, then you can really notice. Otherwise, you're not even aware. But then when somebody does something that upsets you and you look back, you go, oh wow, like for sure that I that was appearing seems like it's not just, I didn't believe I was just positing that through a conceptual mind.
Is it right to think that every conceptual mind is a permanent object?
That every conceptual mind is a permanent object. Say more what you mean, I want to make sure I answer it correctly.
I wish I knew. I mean, as opposed to impermanent.
Why would it be permanent?
Because it's a thought.
Because what?
Because it's a thought, a conception.
I think what you're getting at is there's this idea in, I'm sorry to say it right, oh, there's a term for this, but like that, I think what you're getting at is, it comes from the, I think, Sautantrika school's explanation of, what's the right word term? There's a term for it, like sometimes, the different translators use different terms, like generic image or mental image.
Meaning generality.
Meaning generality, that's the term I was trying to think of. That those are permanent, right? Because they're they're conceptual minds that are exclusionary, right? Like, where you're saying, this is a light because it's not a car or a bus or whatever. It's a light, and then our what was the term you used? The meaning generality light is permanent because it's not a functioning thing. Like in other words, the actual lamp is a functioning thing, but the meaning generality lamp that we project on it into is not. Yeah, so that would be, that's I think what you're saying, that those are permanent phenomena because they're not from the Sautantrika school's sort of explanation, which other schools accept. That conceptual mind, it doesn't mean it can't change, but it's not changing instant by instant the way functioning dependently
is new and replaces.
Yeah, exactly. So that's their view. Yeah, that would those are all permanent.
So it's not really permanent either.
Not permanent in the sense of
right.
eternal, but permanent in the sense of not changing instant by instant. Like later if somebody taught you something new and then you like, oh, I always misunderstood what lamps are. They're this. Your meaning generality would have a new one, but it would be replaced. But it's not changing instant by instant the way.
And that's because it's a form, like a platonic form or something.
In that school, I guess it's because it's sort of a. What they actually say is that's because it exists by way of exclusion. So like that when kids are learning language, they have to learn the difference. Like this isn't, like they have to learn the difference. They might see something like, at first a kid who saw like a hippopotamus and an elephant, they might think they're the same thing, right? And then somebody has to go, no, that's not a hippopotamus because it has a trunk. And then you go, oh, it's not a hippopotamus. So you develop this kind of, and that's philosophical school, they have this idea that these meaning generalities arise due to exclusion. Like, it's not a person because it doesn't have 2 legs, it has 4, and it's not a hippopotamus because it has a trunk, and it's not a horse because horses are a little taller and have a longer neck, and or whatever. And like, eventually they sort of develop a concept that excludes these other concepts, and that isn't a functioning thing, it's just a conceptual thing that exists by way of exclusion, and that's not changing instant by instant. It's just a sort of, it's not an ideal form in the sense of something that actually, because they would say those aren't, that school would say that those aren't inherent, those, well, they don't use the term inherently existing. They would say those aren't, that those are just, what's the say, right? That those aren't ultimate truths. Let's put it that way. So that's why I would say it's not an ideal form.
Empty.
Yeah, they see those as empty. Like those, and actually they say things are empty of those. They believe that, you know, they believe there is something truly existent, like partless particles and things like that, but they don't think that that elephant is truly existent or something, or inherent. Or they think empty, they would say that, again, they don't use the word truly existent. They would say, you know, it's empty of existing as that there are these partless particles that are really there from its own side, but not elephant isn't there from its own side, or something like that. So they would say that those conceptual superposition, actually it's interesting though, they would say I mean, they don't use this term, but they could, from that school's position, you could actually say that's a conceptual superimposition, right? But that's a grosser that's a much, much, much grosser superimposition than what Chandrakirti is getting at. And if you can't tell the difference, then you don't yet really understand what Chandrakirti is getting at. And then you go, oh wow.
We could ultimately end up at the same place. That analysis they could end up at the same place.
What Lama Tsongkhapa's position seems to be, at least my understanding, which I think is correct on this point, is that other, like understanding, say, again, this isn't what he's getting at here, but that understanding, say, that a lower tenet school system of what we're superimposing, without understanding the subtle one that Chandrakirti, he's going to say this actually in a couple of pages, without understanding what Chandrakirti is talking about, will not uproot samsara, will not end your samsara, will not stop the 12 links of dependent variation, but it's a useful introduction for somebody who's not yet ready for Chandrakirti's. Like, whereas that if Chandrakirti's position is too subtle or too frightening or too, oftentimes the way it's taught in tenet systems in the tradition of Lama Tsongkhapa is that those other philosophical positions are actually useful. And actually, I'll just say my own experience that it's been true. Like, there are times where I thought I understood what Chandrakirti was talking about, and then I would read a lower tenet school system, and I would think, that's the same as what Chandrakirti's saying. And I was like, oh, I don't understand what Chandrakirti's saying. So it's quite useful in that way. You know, like, it's really useful to study those others, but they sometimes use this metaphor of they're stepping stones towards, you know, that if you can understand what, say, the mind-only school or the Sautantrika school, whatever the sutras, those who follow sutra means, those other philosophical tenet systems are saying, it's like you can understand that, it won't uproot your samsara, but you can go, then when you get to understanding Chandrakirti, you can have a subtler, and that's why, like, if you look in the, for example, in the monastic, when the monks at the, say at Sarah, study, and Gyandan, Drepung, actually, first they study stuff from the Sautantrika school, right? And they, at other points, study things from, from mind-only school, and from, and it's only quite late in their training that they study Majjhimaka. And the idea is that those other trainings, that, you know, eventually they do a huge year, like over a few years on the Majjhimaka Avatar, that Kenshin Rinpoche is teaching. But they do that later in their studies because the idea is that if you've studied these other things, you're more prepared. If you tried to study that at first, it would be you wouldn't understand it as easily. So they actually study texts from other tenet systems first, and then they study Chandrakirti because it's easier to understand them if you've understood those other systems. But they're not. But Lama Tsongkhapa very clearly says if you only understand that other system, that will not uproot samsara.
Dr. Lauren, going back to the part where we define concepts about objects, all 4 schools would agree to the fact that, say, as a baby, when we say an apple, baby's mind would look at an apple and say this word apple and this object called apple is apple because it's not banana, it's not orange, it looks different than all of that. So for a conceptual mind, all four schools would agree that the object level definition of objects are eliminative in nature, and
Yeah.
that's why it's concepts.
Yeah. So now Lama Tsongkhapa says he's talking a little bit about the statement about where Chandrakirti used the metaphor of the snake. He says this statement explains that from the point of view of being imputed, while not being established by way of their own entities, attachment and so forth resemble a snake imputed to a rope. Yet the latter is not the same as attachment and so forth in terms of whether or not they conventionally exist. Right. So he's clarifying what we just said. Right. He's saying our mental afflictions like attachment, anger, also do not exist by way of their own entity, just like the snake doesn't exist by way of its own entity on the rope. Right? But then he's saying, but don't mistake that as not existing at all. Right? The snake doesn't exist at all. Your mental afflictions do exist conventionally. Right? So he's differentiating conventional existence, and it's a very important point, right? Because when you refute ultimate existence or existence by way of its own entity, that's not refuting conventional existence. Does that make sense? And so this is he's making this point to prevent nihilism, which is the worst. You know, if you came out of studying emptiness with a nihilistic view, that would be the worst problem, or the worst mistake that you could make. So he's saying, don't make that mistake. Your mental afflictions do exist conventionally, but they don't exist independent of the conceptual mind. They exist as merely labeled, right, or as merely dependent upon the conceptual mind. Now he's going into more. So now the next section on page 243, the title or the section is called "A Detailed Explanation of the Apprehension of a Self." Right. So you get the idea here. He's really trying to go into great detail about about ignorance, right? About how we grasp the self. Because if we don't understand this, we won't understand. Then we'll be refuting something that's not the actual thing to be refuted, right? Will negate the wrong object, not the object of negation that Chandrakirti is saying, the negation of which will liberate us from samsara. So he says here, for these reasons, the manner of apprehending things as truly existent, which is the object of negation, right? That's that term I'm using, right? So notice what he's saying here. What's the object of negation? It's the manner of apprehending things as truly existent, which is a synonym for what he said in the previous page. So object of negation, manner of apprehending things as truly existent, and existing by way of their own entity are all synonyms. Does that make sense? He's saying that these are all have the same meaning. He's using different terms to get across an idea. He said, and this is also let's just read, is to apprehend them as not posited by the power of beginningless conception, but is established over and above objects by way of their own entities. Right? So this is answering both Fidel's question and also Lisa's question from earlier, right? When he said, what's the definition of existing by way of his own entity? He's saying it very clearly here, right? Also, when you're saying, why does it happen? He says it right here, right? Beginningless conception, right? That it happens due to beginningless habit. He's saying what I said, I said that's where it comes from. Right, so he's saying here, really analyze this paragraph, this sentence rather, a little bit carefully, right? So what does it mean, right? Because again, we have to understand, this is like the key point in a way, the object of negation. So the object of negation is to apprehend things as if they are truly existent, right? Or existent by way of their own entity, which means that there's over and above, right? I like this phrase. So he says two different things. Not apprehend them as not posited by the power of beginningless conception, or as over and above objects by way of their own entity, right? So he's saying, sometimes Lama Tsongkhapa uses this phrase that over and above, he'll translate that, or use the phrase as something more than if there's something more there than what's merely conception, right? Merely dependent. There's something as if there's something more there from its own side, or more there than merely labeled, or more there than merely existing through the power of the conceptual mind, right? Independence on the conceptual mind, or through the force of the conceptual mind. So it's this idea of like superimposition, right? And the idea, though, is really important is we don't think we're superimposing that, right? The feeling or the experience is not, oh, I'm it's not like you think, oh, I'm superimposing this. It feels, or you experience it as if it's really there, right, or really there. And you're not recognizing it as a superimposition. So, that's the point. Does that make sense? That the object of negation, or the manner of apprehending true existence or ignorance, is this. It means seeing that there's something there over and above existing through the power of conception, or is not just posited by conception. Does that make sense? He's saying it different ways to get across the idea.
Lama used to call it the exaggeration.
Yeah, superimposition, exaggeration are the same idea, right? Yeah. It's a good word. And now, okay, so now let's keep going. So its referent object is called the self, or inherent existence. Right? So he's using another term, self, right? Two more. One of these terms he's already used, right? Self, right? Self-grasping is the self, right? Or inherent existence, right? So he's using these different terms to try to get across what's the object of negation. So what does inherent mean? Inherent means like the same idea, existing by way of its own entity, or existing from its own side, or it has this sort of independent of the conceptual mind, nature. The non-existence of this with a person as a substratum is thought to be the selflessness of a person. And the non-existence of this with phenomena, such as the eye and the nose as a substratum, is thought to be the selflessness of phenomena. Therefore, the apprehension of that inherent existence as present in persons and phenomena is implicitly understood as the apprehension of the two selves. So part of what he's saying here, right, is like, you get the idea now. Actually, if you were going to say, I'm going to meditate on emptiness, right, but you haven't identified the object of negation, then it's like the word emptiness means empty of something in this context, right? Shunyata, emptiness, right? And so if you haven't identified the object of negation, all he's saying is like, emptiness just means it's empty of that, right? So if you haven't identified that, then how can you meditate on the emptiness of that? Because you don't even know what it's empty of. Does that make sense? So you have to identify what's being negated in emptiness, and then when you negate that, that's emptiness, right? But if you negate something else, that's not emptiness because you haven't identified what's to be negated even. So the word emptiness, in a way, has a good, that's what he's getting at here, right? And then he's saying, and that's what I said earlier, right? And then you can label, it's just conceptual, like another way of, what's the word, categorizing. Is it in terms of, if it's in reference to your own self, then it's the self of a person. If it's anything else, it's the self of phenomena. Now he says, again, the commentary to Arya Davis 400 says, in regards to the so-called self, in this regard, the so-called self is an entity of things that does not depend upon anything else, inherent existence. Its non-existence is selflessness. Owing to the division of phenomena and persons, it is understood as twofold, the selfless of phenomena and the selfless of persons. So again, it's saying the same thing there, isn't it? Very, very clearly, though, isn't it? It says it so clearly there, right? Self is an entity that does not depend upon anything else, particularly on the conceptual mind, right? And that's inherent existence. So over and over again, in different language, he's answering, in a way, Lisa's earlier question, what does inherent existence mean, right? Existing, not dependent upon the conceptual mind. Existing is not more than merely labeled, more than something that's merely labeled by the mind. Something like that, different ways to say it. Now he gets into, and again, like, this is what I'll say, some of these paragraphs, like this next one, are why when we were about to enter, a little while before, actually, when Ken Rinpoche was here, or no, when was it? It was before that. At some point, I said to Ken Rinpoche, now we're going to get into the emptiness section. I said, should we just do, like, the highlights? Like, we're going into detail. Because it's quite philosophical, right? And he said, go into every detail, his input. Because I was thinking, well, maybe we just, like, skim. Ken Rinpoche said to go through, so we'll do that. Because now he says, So now, the distinction between apprehension of a self and the view of the transitory collection. Okay. So now Lama Tsongkhapa gets into some further philosophical points. With respect to the observed object of the apprehension of a self of persons. Now, the commentary middle way, I think here what that's referring to is supplement to middle way. So the text that Kent Rinpoche's been teaching. So the supplement to the middle way explains that some Samityas assert part of the 5 aggregates, and some assert only the mind to be the basis or the observed object of the view of a self. As for the mind, again, Chitamatrans and certain Madhyamikas who assert a mind as basis of all. That's the alaya, right? The mind is basis of all. That's asserted by Chitamatrans. Chitamatra means is the Sanskrit for mind only, right? Chita is mind and Matran is only. So the mind only school, right? So he's saying followers of the mind only school and certain Madhyamikas. By certain Madhyamikas, they're like, he's referring there to like Madhyamikas like Shanta Rakshita, who are Yogacara Svatantrika Madhyamikas, right? So they're Madhyamikas, but they follow the Yogacara, they follow certain parts of the Yogacara, such as asserting a mind as basis of all, an alaya, right? So he's saying here the mind only school and those particular Madhyamikas assert an alaya, a mind as basis of all, and they say that the mind as basis of all is the observed object of the self. Right? And he says, and some assert, other Buddhist philosophers assert that it's the mental consciousness that's the basis of the self, of a person, right? So there, part of the point is, right, so you get what he's getting at here. He's saying, so we talk about a self of persons, right? And then he's saying, so within Buddhism, within the Buddhist tradition, and also in non-Buddhist traditions too, different philosophical schools will assert different things. Like when you say, well, what's the real basis of a person, right? And some will say, well, it's the mind. Some will say it's the mind. Some will say it's the 5 aggregates, right? Others will say it's just one of the aggregates, the mental consciousness. Others will say, well, it's not the regular mental consciousness, it's the mind as basis of all, which is like a separate sort of storehouse consciousness of karma and so on, that goes from life to life in that system. Now he says, however, with these systems, when it comes to the meaning invested in the designation of person, the one cultivating the paths and the one resolving in cyclic existence and so forth, you need to know the 2 modes of positing a mere I and positing something like a mind as basis of all as the basis of the I's characteristics. So what he's getting at there is this, apart from the Prasangika Madhyamaka school of Chandrakirti, every other philosophical school says there does have to be some, in order to posit a self that cycles in samsara and that progresses along the path, you have to have something that ultimately is a referent to that self. And that's, so they would say it's the mind as basis of all, right? The alaya, for example. And what he's saying is, Chandrakirti and the Prasangikas are unique in saying, no, there is no findable. There's no findable basis for that I at all. But there is an I. It's the merely labeled I. The I, so they would say the merely labeled I, or the I, that's what he says, the mere I, right? The mere I, or the I that's merely, what's the word? Posited by the conceptual mind, that's the I that goes through samsara. So like when you say, so there is no.
So a mind stream that goes from one life to the next life, that is Lorne, is not findable in any sense as Lorne. It's completely irrelevant whether it was a part of the Lorne mind stream or a part of the Jeff mind stream.
Actually, if you use that example, right? Like the mind stream, and actually, you have to say, if we're going to follow Chandrakirti's system, you say the mind stream that's currently labeled as Jeff,
which is fine.
Wasn't labeled as Jeff before.
Which is fine. And then
his mom.
Today Jeff dies. And that mind stream, unlabeled, is migrating. In an unlabeled form, it's migrating. Is
But
it
the
not?
karma, but the karma does carry over though.
But does it stay, I mean, it sounds like you're suggesting it would stay Jeff as it proceeds, and I don't think it does.
Well, it doesn't stay Jeff, but it also doesn't become Lorne.
No, that's
But
correct.
doesn't it kind of like get reabsorbed into the board? I'm sorry,
No. No.
I'm not sure I get the question or the point. Like, what's the main, like, because of course, right? Like, it's not. Of course, in the Bardo, it's not called. But actually, one point I'll make just to disagree with one point you made is it's not unlabeled, or it's no longer labeled Jeff, right? But actually, and this is part of the point though that Chandrakirti would say, like one person, like actually this is part of what Chandrakirti is getting at in a way, is like I might be. Like, let's assume that happened, right? That you passed away someday, right? And so like, on the one hand, if Lisa were still alive at that point, she might say, wow, where'd Jeff take rebirth? That would be a normal question, right, linguistically. Maybe she'd ask some Lama that. Right? She'd be so missing you. Where'd Jeff take rebirth? I've got to go find him. So she'd be labeling, so she'd be labeling that Jeff, right? Then let's say you had some parents and they were calling you Norbu or something, right? Or Tibet, or something like, or whatever. Then they would say, Norbu has such a strong connection to Dharma. I wonder who he was in a past life, right? So at the same time, like Lisa could be labeling Jeff, and those other people could be labeling Norbu. So are there two beings? This starts to get the point, right? Like, so it's not that there isn't a continuum, right? But a continuum exists as merely labeled by the mind, by the conceptual mind.
But there's a distinguishable part of that continuum that is not just merely labeled, because it is the karmic continuation of this entity, not that entity. It's a separate entity, right? My karma and your karma are not the same.
Nope.
They're differential, right?
Yep.
But
And the point that-
of your whole past, and doesn't that like bring karma with it as well? I mean, they get like tokus, any toku, that they are the reincarnate of the prior monk or Rinpoche or whatever, but they're reborn into another body. And look at someone like Oso who's he's not expressing himself. He's not Lama Yeshe, he's Oso. But boy, you can see a lot of people who knew Lama Yeshe see him all in there, but he's Oso. You know what I mean? So it's impermanent, right? So isn't that self impermanent and progressing now that it's at this stage in this new body? I mean,
Yeah, I think you two are making two different points. But first of all, yeah, it is impermanent for sure. In other words, and the self,
the mind
actually
stream is impermanent.
the mind stream is impermanent. The self is impermanent. The person's impermanent. Better way to say it. But also, and that when one person dies and then takes rebirth, they're not the same person.
Right,
That's
I was
true.
thinking more
That's
in terms
always
of
true.
mind stream.
Yeah, that's true. But then go back to but Jeff, you're making a different point, which is exactly what Lama Tsongkhapa is addressing.
What?
You're making a different point, which is exactly what Lama Tsongkhapa is addressing, and you're disagreeing with Lama Tsongkhapa, which is good.
I'm saying, I've been having this conversation with y'all for the last 6 months, which is nothing continues. You cannot describe the mental continuum continuing as something. You're saying he's arguing logically, he's arguing no, and you're arguing no, and I'm saying, but it's demonstrable, right? It is a continuum of a certain mind stream, not all mind streams, not if undifferentiated mind streams, but an identifiable mind stream.
And part of what we're getting at here is this: is like, I'm going to use actually a traditional. I mean, it's not mine. I think it comes from Shantideva. I think it's Shantideva who says this. if I remember correctly. Like, because he's talking about a continuum as a collection, right? A collection of moments.
Right.
And so Chandrakirti makes this point. He says, he uses an example of an army, right? And so, like, he makes this point, like, if two armies are coming into a war, he says, like, you know, he makes a point, he says, an army is made up of parts, people. There are many different soldiers, right, in each army. And then based on those, like, you can't, if there are no soldiers, you can't say you have an army, right? But if there's a collection of soldiers, like let's say there's soldiers from this country and soldiers from that country, and then based on that collection, then you label, oh, this is the American army, and this is the whatever, you know, like, and based on the collection, you label. And so what Shantideva there is saying is, you know, so based on the mere label, like the army exists as merely label, but if you were to, like, if you were to search each soldier, like if you so in other words, if you said, like, is this if you were to say, is this soldier the American army? Well, no, they may retire from the military. If they get killed, the American army still exists, so they're not the American army. You know, then there's this soldier, the American army. Well, no, because if they get killed, the American army still exists. You know, and so on, right? Or if they retire from the military, the American army. So, like, there's no ultimately findable basis for American army. But conventionally, you can say two armies, you know, the American army's invading this country or something.
Right.
And so he's saying it exists. So Chandrakirti and Shantideva are saying, does the American army exist? Yes. How does it exist? As merely labeled by the conceptual mind.
Right.
And it functions, right? It kills people and invades countries and takes over governments or whatever. Like, so it exists. But it exists merely through the power of, it functions, it exists. How does it exist? Merely labeled by the conceptual mind. There's no ultimately findable basis of that army.
I'll accept that.
But it functions, and it functions very powerfully in the world, right? Like, and so on. And so he's saying it's the same here. The mental continuum, does it exist? Yes, it exists. How? Merely labeled on its parts.
I got it.
Yeah.
So what if you don't give it a name?
And that's important too. Like, it was what they say is that name is also like, let's say this right. We sometimes think of name as like only human name, you know. But one thing that one day I got confused about that point. So one day I was asking Ken Trumshay actually about this, and I was saying, well, like, insects don't use language the way humans do. Like, that's clear, right? Like, they don't say, hey, pass the sugar, you know, something like, you know, I didn't say it that way. I would say it that way, it's Trumshay, but you get my point. Like, and he was saying, oh, don't think of language as just human. Like, in other words, in this sense of merely labeled, he was saying if you watch an insect go towards, you know, like, go towards sugar and pick up the sugar and carry it, they have their own label. It's not like human label. It's not like our labels. But clearly, you know, if you, like, in other words, if you bang the table, you know, and if you spray, or if you put something that smells disturbing to them, they run away. You know, if you put sugar, they go towards it and they carry it and they bring it back to their home or whatever, to their other insects and so on. And so what he was getting at was that language is not just human language, and that language is much more instinctual in a way. And like even babies, before, like, they don't yet know words, right? But there's lots of research now showing that babies they recognize the face, you know, and like they smile when they see one face, and they'll, like, if it's a stranger's face, or if it's you know, and then if it's their mother, for example, they have a certain.
So that's the labeling.
And yeah, and like they can recognize, the babies can nurse, right? So there's a recognition of the breast, and that's it. So like there's a very basic level of labeling that we in our Western language would call pre-verbal, but it's a kind of language that's not yet human language.
So you can project without using concept.
It's concepts, but it's not a word yet. It's like but it's a label. Like it's an interesting.
So what if you see a base without let's say you see that stuff there. And then I don't see for the first somebody Amazon, you know, he comes and they see that stuff. Then nobody tells him anything about it. How will he perceive it? How will he perceive that?
Yeah, and that's where, like, so part of the point is, like, as we learn language, of course, our labels change, you know, and we develop very complicated systems of labeling. But part of what I think this idea of, like, what does they say, right? Like, I guess they would say, because, you know, remember this whole thing, it all, what does he say? Beginningless, I forget how he, beginningless conception, right? Beginningless conceptual mind. And that's part of the point there. So, like, the baby, for example, who has no language, due to beginningless conceptuality, can still experience desire, right? And still experiences, this is, so like, I'm putting human language on this, but there's some very fundamental level of, I want that, right? And I don't want that. That's a kind of, already, there's labeling going on there. You know, and even before the baby can say mom, for example, there's some sense of attachment. And so the attachment depends upon a conceptual mind. That's not using human language, but there's a kind of concept there.
To see energy to energy or something?
Yeah, you can say that.
But there's self-grasping there too, right?
Yeah, and self-grasping is there. Self-grasping is there actually all the time.
Right.
There's like, even in the bardo, self-grasping is there. In the womb, self-grasping is there. Always self-grasping is there. We're never, yeah, it's, Kensho Rishi said that. It's, I double-checked that because I was like, I had a question about it. He said, until you realize emptiness, there's always some level of self-grasping. It can be very subtle, but... Yeah.
So in the case of the face, so that baby recognizing the face, in some sense, in English language, that's the baby recognized the face, right? It's like it identified that the face is familiar for one reason or another. So is it true then to say, like, if I'm practicing and I can move to where I'm identifying the object and moving it towards where it just becomes an object, right? So, you know, like in English language, there's the face and then there's the a face.
A face. Yeah.
So is that kind of, so I'm just trying to, like, from my practice perspective, if I start to move away from the face and start to make it just another face, is that moving away from kind of that attachment?
Yeah, what I would say is that's like what you're describing, I think, if I understand, I think I understand correctly, would be moving towards equanimity, for example,
Yeah.
and away from attachment and aversion. That's not yet the object of negation,
Yeah,
but that is a correct, that would be like, that one would be moving away from attachment and aversion towards equanimity, actually, is what I think you're describing. Where you then kind of recognize a kind of even, equanimity or even-mindedness, right, where one kind of has an equal sense of, and not like, oh, this is my, you know, oh, this is the one I want, this is the one I don't want. Yes, that would be like.
But if I get to the A face, that's still me. I'm still labeling. I'm
Yeah.
still not okay.
Yeah, exactly. There's still a kind of self-grasping there as that it's a face existing from its own side. That's not yet as subtle as what Chandrakirti is talking about, but it is a positive Dharma practice, right, to move towards less attachment. But it's not yet addressing this idea of that it exists. We're still not recognizing that even a face exists through the power of the conceptual mind, and that it appears to exist with its own entity out there, independent of my conceptual mind. But I'm actually, even a face is a conceptual superimposition, and so on. Yeah, so that'll be a virtuous or positive Dharma practice, but not yet the object of negation. So you get the idea. So he's saying the Prasangika school is unique, right, in not asserting some ultimate basis of the person. Right? All the other schools say there has to be some kind of findable basis for a person. He's saying, like the example of the army that I gave, right? There is no findable basis for the army, but the army exists. There is no findable basis for the person, but the person exists merely through the power of the conceptual mind. It's quite a useful, that metaphor is good, isn't it, from Shantideva, for a collection, you can call it. Then he says, now he's getting into that phrase innate that I used earlier. So he says, with respect to the innate view of the transitory collection, again, we're going in like deep philosophical territory, which is an apprehension of a self, Chandrakirti supplements the middle way, refutes that the aggregates are its observed object. And in the commentary, it is said that the dependently imputed self is the observed object. Right? So he's saying there are a couple points. One is, some people, right, say the aggregates are the, what's the phrase you use? Observed object of the self, right? And he's saying, and what he's saying here is Chandrakirti disagrees with that, right? That he's saying the observed object is just the merely labeled, the merely, like, that he's emphasizing this point, it exists through the mere power of conception. There is no ultimate basis, right? That's what we heard him saying. Here, though, also, he's focusing on a couple other points, right? He's saying this is the, what's it say, right? That those other views, right, that it's the mind as basis of all, and so on, those are philosophically acquired, right? There's, well, I'll keep going. He says it. Yes, he says it here, so I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. So he says, it is said that even the mere collection of the aggregates is not the conventional self. So neither the collection of the aggregates at one time, nor the collection which is a continuum of the aggregates from an earlier to a later moment are its observed object. Rather, the mere I, which is the observed object of the mere thought I arising, or the mere person, should be taken as its observed object. Neither the individual object aggregates nor their collection is posited as the basis of that I's characteristics. However, this point, an unsurpassed distinguishing feature of this system, the Prasangika system, has been explained in great detail elsewhere. And actually what he's saying there is, remember, this is one of his last two great treatises, Lama Tsongkhapa's last two great treatises on emptiness. So he's saying that he went into much more detail on this point in his Ocean of Reasoning, which is a commentary to Nagarjuna's Wisdom, and also in the Lamrim Chenmo, the great treatise of this series. But here, he's saying, right, he's just making this point. There is, if other philosophical schools sort of assert that there's some findable basis for the ascription I, and he's saying no, the I exists like that army, right? Like again, think of Shantideva's metaphor, right? Or example rather, right? The army exists, the army functions in the world, right? But if if you searched every single soldier, right? If there's like, whatever, 100,000 soldiers or more, right? A few 100,000 soldiers, right? If you search every single one of them, they're not the U.S. Army, right? And again, because first of all, if they retire, the U.S. Army still exists. If you kill them, the U.S. Army still exists. And so it's proof that they're not the U.S. Army, right? So there's no findable basis, right? And the same thing if you say, well, is this one tank, is that the U.S.? No, of course not, right? So there is no findable basis, and yet it exists and functions merely through the power of conception, right? We say, oh, that's the U.S. Army, right? And so that's one. So, and he's saying just like that, there's no findable basis in any of the parts. He's saying whether you look at the whole collection of the five aggregates, or if you pick one of them, which many schools pick the consciousness, he says, no, that's not the basis. If you search the moments of consciousness, there's no I there. It's just moments of consciousness, merely clear, merely knowing awareness. That's not self. That's a mere awareness, right? He's saying, and those are just moments. Is one moment the self? No, of course not, right? Just like if you were to search, if you search one moment of clear and knowing awareness, is that the self? Of course not, right? But based on a continuum of those, you can label and say that's. And so he's saying it's the mere I, right? That's when he says the mere I. It's the one that's labeled by conceptual mind. There is no findable basis. Then he says, the mind thinking I that arises toward the observed object of the innate view of the transitory collection must arise naturally. Therefore, although the innate apprehension of the self of a person that apprehends the person associated with someone else's continuum to be established by way of its own entity, own character is innate, it is not the innate view of the transitory collection of that person. So here what he's saying is, so first of all, the innate view of the transitory collection, right? First of all, that's a philosophical term, and part of it is like, I mean, all Buddhist, many Buddhist schools use that. I don't know if they all do or not, actually, but many Buddhist schools use that term, the view of the transitory collection. Part of that is, they're pointing out that all like even in the lower philosophical schools, they have this point, right? That the aggregates are a transitory collection, right, of stuff, right? There's nothing permanent in the aggregates, right? And all Buddhist schools actually say that we tend to grasp a self on that transitory collection of stuff. Does that make sense? So they all agree on that point. But each philosophical school has different, if you get to the subtle definition of what's the ignorance, then they differ, you know, there are different levels of subtlety, right? And so here he's, that general term, transitory collection, now he's using Chandrakirti's approach to say what's the ignorance, that's the view of the view of a self in the transitory collection. But so anyway, here in this paragraph, what he's getting at though, is the view of the transitory collection, right, the ignorance grasping at a self, that's the view of the transitory collection, is the cause of samsara. Right? Now he's saying, you know, we could say, like if I'm going to meditate on emptiness, and I were to think about the truly existent mic, that's not my view of a transitory collection, right? In other words, that what he's saying here is that the view of the transitory collection that I need to meditate on primarily is my own, right? Not somebody else's. And that it's true, what he's getting at here is, it's true that I do innately grasp at a self of Rajiv and of Mike and of whoever I see. That's true, actually. So there is an innate grasping at the self. And he's saying, so that is a kind of innate grasping, but it's not the view of the transitory collection. It's not the main topic that you need to meditate on primarily, which is your own. So he's saying the innate view of the transitory collection is a particular kind of innate grasping at a self of person, your own person. Does that make sense? Not somebody else's person. And that's the main object to meditate on. So that's what he's getting at there.
Well, he's trying to probably avoid the nihilism part of it. Right? If I'm going to meditate and Dr. Lauren doesn't exist, that's not the right meditation. I can do it. Then
Right,
I'd be saying the other people don't exist. I do exist.
Yeah, exactly. That'd be a very bad problem.
So the Buddha still has the innate, right?
The Buddha has, the Buddha doesn't have innate self-grasping.
No, he just innate, like innate I.
You could say the Buddha has a, sorry, there are different, like, this is not in this section, but there's, they sometimes differentiate, I think what your question is, like, about what does the Buddha have, they sometimes differentiate. So there's an I that is what Lama Tsongkhapa is talking about here, which is the truly existent, or the self, or the I that's inherent, like let's say the I that's the object of negation.
Yes.
The Buddha doesn't have that, because he's negated it.
Yeah.
But then there's the mere I, right? The Buddha does have that. Everybody has that, right? The Buddha, we say the Buddha walked to Rajgriha and taught the perfection of wisdom. So that's his mere I. We could talk about. And the Buddha also has, so you could say the Buddha has a mere I.
So what's the difference between the mere I and the innate I?
Like the innate I of a self-grasping is a kind of ignorance, right? Which doesn't exist. Actually, the best way to say this is the I that we're talking about here, right? The view of the transitory collection is something you grasp at, but that doesn't really exist. It has no existence. It's a hallucination. It doesn't really exist. Whereas the mere I does exist conventionally. So the Buddha has it because it exists. You know, so the Buddha you can say the Buddha walked to Rajgriha and taught the perfection of wisdom sutra because that happened conventionally. But if you say the view of the transitory collection or the view of the innate, innate self-grasping, that object of the self-grasping, that I that exists from its own side doesn't exist, actually. So that's the way to differentiate them. One is a hallucination or a non-existent phenomena that we sort of make up. It's like the snake, you know, like it'd be like saying the snake on the rope. It doesn't exist at all. So the I that's the false I that's the view of the innate self-grasping doesn't exist. The mere I does exist conventionally.
So let's say like the Buddha, right? He doesn't create, when you become a Buddha, you don't create karma. But that means the karma you had has been eliminated, not eliminated, but just like cut down, right?
It was all, I guess you say purified, maybe somewhere.
Purified. But that which was creating karma was innate mind, right? It wasn't the mere I.
The karma that the being created before they became enlightened was based on ignorance, yeah.
Based on the innate mind. So if you can eliminate, but it's not the mere I.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
No, actually, like, you can say, actually, I mean, what's there to say, right? Like, actually, it's a very subtle point you were getting at. Like, so, let's say a person, based on their self-grasping, right? Like, so I'm grasping me, truly existent me, and then a truly existent other person. Then, based on that ignorance, right? Like, I feel I exist intrinsically, and this other person exists intrinsically. Then they do something I don't like, so I hate them, right? And then I kill them, right? Let's imagine that scenario, right? So, in one hand, what's it called? The mode of apprehension of an I in that story is incorrect. Right? It's a hallucination. I'm hallucinating that I truly exist independently. Also, my view of this other person is incorrect. Right? I'm viewing them as existing intrinsically. But if I kill them, so that's all false. But there is a mere I that killed, and that did conventionally occur. Right? In other words, if I killed the person, then a person could correctly say, "Oh, he killed him," right? And that's true. So it's both. In other words, the motivation or the reason why I would have the hatred and do the action of killing is based on ignorance. And so that's the ignorance. The object of ignorance is false, but the mere I does the act of killing. Does that make sense? So there is a mere I still that does those karma. So there is a mere I that accumulates karma. Or again, if I practice generosity, let's say somebody makes the water bowls, you can say, oh, like I don't know who poured the water bowl. You can say, oh, this person, who did that? Oh, okay. So we could say, Paul offered water bowls today, right? And that's a correct verbal. He actually did it, right? So it's a correct. What's the word? There is a mere I that collects karma by doing a positive action in that case, right? So there is a mere I, and that exists conventionally, and that's. And the mere I does accumulate karma, and it does exist, and the karma functions. So it's a subtle distinction. Yeah, so the mere I does accumulate karma, because it does actions, conventionally speaking.
So can sound accumulate karma?
Can what?
Sound.
Can sound accumulate karma?
Yeah.
No, because actually what Chandra Kiri say, I think the view of this school would be that a person accumulates karma, right? A being accumulates karma. Now they can accumulate verbal karma through making a sound.
Yeah.
But it's still a person who accumulates, the mere I of the person accumulates the karma, not the sound itself. The sound might be like in other words, a person can accumulate verbal karma by saying something kind or by saying something cruel, saying something a lie. The person accumulates karma through making sound, but the sound itself doesn't accumulate karma.
Because like I would translate, like, if the base was sounds that exist in me and name, and we can be the best for community.
Yeah, it seems though that the basis for accumulating karma, according to this system, is the mere I.
Yeah.
Okay. Then the next paragraph here, he says, so he says the observed object of the innate view of the transitory collection. So actually, I should say one comment here. When they talk about the innate view of the transitory collection in general, in Buddhist philosophy, there's I and mine. Both are used. So he was saying, for the I, he was pointing out it has to be your own continuum, not somebody else's, right? Now he's addressing mine. So that's why, just to be clear, because he's going to say mine here. So the observed object of the innate view of the transitory collection apprehending mine is the mind itself, the observed object of the innate mind thinking mind. It should not be held that one's eyes and so forth of the observed object. So there what he's getting at is, in this school's view, the innate view of transitory collection, there's I and mind, right? So what he's saying here is that the mind part of that is the sense of mindness, or it's that sense of mindness is the way or the sense of mind, that sense of being mind or mindness. But it's not the objects. Because the objects of mind are phenomena. So because once you say my hand, it's that sense of mindness is the view of the transitory collection. But once you say hand, that's the self of phenomena. A hand is because then a hand is not an I. It's not a me. It's a object, right? So then once you say hand, that becomes an object. Like, so it has 5 fingers and a palm and all that. And so he's just getting it, it's just a fine philosophical point, or a fine detail, which is the view of the transitory collection is the sense of mindness. And once you talk about the objects of that, such as your eyeball or your ear or your hand, that becomes, when they talk selfless as a phenomena, that's a phenomena, not the view of the transitory collection. So it's just a philosophical detail.
So Dr. Lauren, the distance between the self, me, and mind, there has to be some sort of conception, a desire or a hatred in between, saying it's mine. There's a distance between those two.
In this sense,
it's not the same mind moment where self and mind can be completed at the same time.
I would agree with that part of what you said, but I don't think it has to have desire or hatred yet. This would still be ignorance. Like, so in other words, the sense of because, like, what's there to say? The sense of mindness serves as a basis for giving rise to the mental affliction. In other words, so like in other words, like so that sense of mindness is still kind of a view of the transitory collection, which would be included under, if you think of the 3 poisons, that would be included under ignorance. And then based on that, you give rise to, then if you think somebody's harming what's mine, or somebody's helping what's mine, then you give rise to the other desire and anger.
But the object has to be there when you define it. Like in the case of self, my hand, the object is the hand.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a distance between self and when the self imputes mind.
Right. Yeah, that's true. I agree with that. Yeah, no, I agree with that. I was just saying, but it's not. That doesn't necessarily have to be other mental affliction yet.
Oh, okay.
That was all I said. But yeah, I agree with that other part. And it says, its aspect is to observe that object of observation and apprehend the mind to be established by way of its own character. Right? So again, it's part of what's being said here, right? Is this sense of mindness, that's the view of the transitory collection, doesn't say the hand is merely conceptually labeled as mine, right? Like it's this innate sense of mindness, right, that you ascribe to those things, right? And yeah, so you get the idea, right? And that's yeah. I won't go into more detail because that's what he's saying. Sorry about that. Yeah. Oh yeah.
So so no self-grasping, does he mean there's no mental affliction, no attachment, all will be gone?
Right. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. If you can overcome self-grasping, then all the mental afflictions stop. Like, he says that very clearly at other points in here. He says, like, if you say you apply an antidote to anger, like love, right, then you can decrease or stop your anger. Or if you meditate on an antidote to attachment, like seeing seeing something as unattractive, then you can decrease or stop your attachment temporarily, through that. But only this, overcoming, as you said, self-grasping, that cuts off all the mental afflictions. When you realize, and when you're in the realization of emptiness, no mental affliction can arise. If you're realizing emptiness, for example, and he makes it actually later in this paragraph, in this chapter, he uses a metaphor. Actually, he says to get at exactly what you're saying, where he says, he uses an example where he says, our bodily consciousness. He says it's in all of our bodies. So if somebody touches you here, you feel it. If they touch you here, you feel it. If you see, your eyeballs have, your ears, everything is connected. When your consciousness is in your body, right? You're alive, and so you're aware. You're in this body. Then all your senses function, right? But then he says, but if you, when the person, if the consciousness leaves that body, all the different senses, it's not like it just stops feeling here. Everything stops, right? And he says, just like that, ignorance, self-grasping, pervades all the different mental afflictions. And if you cut off self-grasping, all the mental afflictions stop at one time. They all stop at that time. And it's also the antidote to all of them. So it's an antidote to all mental afflictions. Yeah, it's the wisdom realizing emptiness is the antidote to all the mental afflictions, and that the self-grasping is like it's almost like it's I'll use a metaphor for a second. It's like like a sponge that has water in it or something. It's like that. Like that all the mental afflictions have that in them. And so then it serves as a basis for all of them. So if you cut that off, then all the mental afflictions get cut off. Yeah, Lama Tsongkhapa says that very clearly in here later.
So it's like a pervasive condition that you're.
Yeah, it's a basis, you could say, even, yeah. And it's sort of, it infuses all of them, and it's the basis for all of them. Yeah. I guess that clock is still going. Okay, I wasn't sure if it was correct. But, so I'll do one more paragraph, maybe. Okay, so, the object of the innate apprehension of a self of phenomena, so now he's talking about the self of phenomena, right? Because we talked about the self of persons, now he's talking about the self of phenomena. So he says, the objects of the innate apprehension of a self of phenomena are the form aggregate and so forth, the eyes, the ears, and so forth, associated with own or someone else's continuum, as well as the environments and so forth, which are not included in a continuum of a being, right? So what he's saying here is we talked about the self of person, ultimately that's oneself, right? Now he's saying, what's the self of phenomena? So he's saying, well, it could be external objects like houses and trees and so on, rocks and all that. Or it could also be, a phenomena can also be your own, like the hand is a phenomenon, the eyeball, the ear, the hair, and so on. Those are all phenomena. And he says, so it doesn't have to be, and it says they could be included in somebody's continuum, right? So there is a phenomena, could be like, I see Fidel's ear, right? That's a phenomenon. But it's in his continuum in that sense. Or it could be I see the lamp, which is not in anybody's continuum of being. It's not a being's continuum, but it's still a phenomena, right? Then he says, its aspect is as explained before. In the explanation of Chandrakirti's commentary to the middle way, it says, so again he's quoting Chandrakirti, delusion is the ignorance that superimposes a non-existent own entity of things. It has the nature of obstructing the view of their inherent existence. It conceals them. So this is actually an important point, right? Like what he's saying, Chandrakirti here is saying a couple things. One is, so ignorance, right? He's getting at ignorance in this example is specifically about the phenomena, but it applies to any ignorance, the main point here. So one is, actually sometimes one sentence can be very powerful. Because one thing he's saying is it superimposes, right? And what does it superimpose? A non-existent own entity. That's quite a powerful phrase, right? So it's saying, it's getting at this point, right? What we're superimposing, right, through ignorance, we're superimposing something that doesn't exist onto something, right? A non-existent, and then this word own entity, right? So we're superimposing an own entity, right? So one way, we've already said, philosophically, you can say that means that it exists not somehow as more than independence upon through the power of the conceptual mind, right? But own entity means like it exists on its own, right? It exists in its own nature, or from its own side, or its own entity. Entity is an interesting word, isn't it? Like its own nature, its own being, there, not dependent upon it, right? So it's interesting. The mind is the conceptual mind is what the conceptual mind is superimposing is that things don't exist depends upon the conceptual mind. It's funny, right? Of things, right? Then it says, it has the nature of obstructing the view of their inherent existence. It conceals them, right? So what it's saying is this superimposition stops us from recognizing you could say so they use sometimes like it keeps us from recognizing the actual way things exist, right? Or it conceals the actual nature of that thing, which is emptiness. Does that make sense? Its actual true nature or ultimate nature is emptiness, but the superimposition stops us from seeing that. And so it's getting at a kind of experiential point again, isn't it? And you see, I just want to make sure people get it, like, or keeping this in mind, right? In one way this could seem very, it's philosophy, obviously, right? It's Buddhist philosophy, and it's deep Buddhist philosophy. But you get I hope everybody's keeping in mind, like, if you read this kind of sentence, this is not something distant from your own experience, right? There is Chandrakirti here and Chandrakirti and Lama Tsongkhapa together, in these, he's quoting Chandrakirti, but they're trying to help us, what's the word, like, identify this in our own actual lived in the moment experience in order to then use that in the moment lived experience as the basis for meditating on emptiness and liberating ourselves from suffering, right? So this is not like some mere intellectual exercise. And if somebody would read this and think it was, they would be misunderstanding it, is the point, right? Chandrakirti is trying to say, like, this is what you're doing when you are mad at somebody. This is what you're doing when you're hurt. This is what you're doing when you're craving. This is what you're doing when you're afraid. This is what you're doing, every single mental affliction, you're doing this during it, right? All the time that you're suffering, this is what's happening. All the time that you think you're not suffering, when you are suffering, this is what you're doing, right? Because you think, because you don't recognize that you're even suffering because you're so deluded. He's saying this is what we're doing. Ignorant beings, us, are doing all the time, and he's trying to point it out so that then you can see it, and then you can meditate on emptiness in relation to this very subtle. And you get the idea of how subtle it is, right? This is not. It's like a very subtle object, right? The superimposition of a non-existent own entity. It's quite a subtle object.
I was just thinking what tricksters our minds really are, and then this isn't just talking about the real. I was just thinking about studies of addiction and things like that, and just how intensely. Trickster is what I always call it, because that's what it comes to mind, because it truly, just like it superimposes something that's a big fat lie that you probably actually made up because you want something else. So playing, it's very, very intense.
Yeah, and I agree. And one thing I'll point out is and it's hard, right? It's even experientially, right, from what you're saying, like for all of anybody, right? Like even pretty, what's the word, like. This is hard with fairly gross levels, right? Like of self-deception. Like it's hard to catch that in relation to people you know, or.
And everyday things, I think I really like that when you really want that, but you don't want to admit that to yourself. It's just.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to catch it in relation to even these like everyday gross objects. And what Chandrakirti and Lama Tsongkhapa here are getting at is the most. Literally, it's the most subtle of all self-deceptions. That's what they're saying. And that if you don't identify this most subtle of all, what he's saying, one way of saying it, is that all other self-deceptions come from this self-deception. Right? The self-deception of own entity, or of existing by nature, or of true existence, whatever you want to call it. There are different phrases he uses. But so, if other ones are hard to catch, this one's harder to catch, right? Because it's subtler. But also, what he's saying is, if you can catch this one, it's like like we said in relation to your question, all the other ones, the honest question, all the other ones will end. If you can catch this self-deception and realize its emptiness, all your other self-deceptions will, I'll use another metaphor. It'd be like you could kick one domino out of a big domino thing, but this one would be you hit the first one and they all fall. It's like that metaphor or something. This one is like that. It's like if you can hit this one just the right way, all your other mental afflictions will end. All your other self-deceptions will end. All your misunderstandings will end. And if not, then they won't actually, right? And he'll say that later in here next time we'll get into it. But what he says is otherwise there will still be a basis for self-grasping to come back. And there are many, he's going to go into this more, but there are many wonderful Buddhist teachings that get at grosser levels. And that's good, because we need those, actually. But here he's getting at, all of those eventually lead to this. Does that make sense? That's what they say, is the Buddha said that. All the other teachings of the Buddha ultimately lead towards this wisdom, the wisdom of emptiness. And because there's no other antidote to samsara. And so, when we're overcoming those other grosser ones, it's to prepare us to help us eventually realize this one. And when you realize this one, all the other ones permanently stop. Otherwise, the other ones will come back eventually. Even if you overcome them through an antidote, then eventually they'll reassert themselves out of habituation and samsara and karma. But if you can uproot this self-grasping, all the other mental afflictions will permanently cease if you can fully realize it and habituate yourself to it. So it's a humongously important practical instruction. I guess that's what I always want to emphasize as we conclude today, is that, I know it's a little bit, this is not easy philosophical material, but the reason it's not easy is that, again, it's because well, what is it not? What is there? It's because we're familiarized with its opposites, its beginningless time. But another is like, again, like, there are all kinds of self-deceptions we do, right? And this is like the most subtle of all of them. Remember that. And so he's trying to really carefully point out what it is, because, and he's doing it, last thing I'll say is, because tomorrow's Lama Tsongkhapa Day, his anniversary of his passing, right? I'll just point out, why is Lama Tsongkhapa going into so much detail about this? I mean, actually, because his view, which is the Buddhist view, right? He's looking at us, at future readers, right? And he's saying, like, actually, that's real compassion, right? He's saying, I want them to be freed from suffering. And if they don't find this object in themselves, in their own experience, then they won't be freed from suffering. And they may find some other less subtle object, and that'll help them some, but it won't liberate them. And so out of compassion, he's trying to really give through so many different, right, metaphor, the snake, or, and then these different quotes, and then his own explanation. He's trying all different ways to help us experientially identify that, so that when we go meditate on emptiness, we're actually meditating on the emptiness of the right object, which is the actual emptiness, right? Otherwise, it's like, locking the front door and keep further out of the back.